Shorty Shea, thinking he had tipped the police off about the stolen cars.
They got Shea out of the car, hit him over the head, and then stabbed him. Pushed his body over the side of the road down an embankment.
As the manhunt for the Tate and LaBianca murders seemed to be going nowhere, a break in the investigation came from a murder in LA's music industry. 7 people had been brutally murdered in 2 August nights in Los Angeles. The Sharon Tate murder had pierced the heart of Hollywood. The next night, members of the city's business community had been slain. A death in LA's music industry was about to crack the case and lead detectives to Charles Manson. The victim was Gary Hinman. His musical connections had brought him into contact with Charlie.
Manson thought that Hinman had come into a large inheritance, and Manson wanted Hinman's possession.
Manson sent family members Bobby Beausoleil, Mary Brunner, and Susan Atkins to Gary's home 2 weeks before the assault on Sharon Tate.
They tortured Hinman for 2 days, and he kept denying that he had any money. They called Manson, says he's not giving up the money.
Charlie took matters into his own hands.
Manson was carrying a sword, and he sliced Hinman across the left side of the face and cut his left ear. And then Manson more or less told Beausoleil, well, you know what to do.
Beausoleil killed Gary after Manson left. The family members left their signature at the crime scene.
When the sheriff's homicide detectives came over to LAPD to try and interest them and that there may be a connection between the Hinman murder and the Tate and LaBianca murders, they were brushed off and not given the time of day. And as it turned out, they were right.
As autumn approached, the Tate and LaBianca cases remained cold. Then Beausoleil was stopped while driving Gary Hinman's car. He was held as a suspect in the murder. Susan Atkins was also arrested for Gary's murder after Beausoleil's girlfriend incriminated her.
When she was in custody, she had 2 cellmates that were high-end prostitutes. And Susan was bragging to them about the Tate and LaBianca murders. So they both ended up calling Hollywood homicide. And they both related what Susan Atkins said, and that's what broke the case.
As Atkins was giving details of the murders, the police were already planning a raid on Manson's new home in Death Valley. Once again, it was for car theft. Manson tried to hide during the raid.
When the Highway Patrol and the Inyo County Sheriffs raided Barker Ranch, he hid under the kitchen sink. And, I mean, he's a little guy. He got under there, and, you know, they opened the cupboard, and, oh, well, look who's here. And they didn't think he was anybody special at the time, other than, you know, he was involved in the stolen vehicles.
This time, they weren't released.
In my wildest dreams, I never could imagine that my auto theft investigation would have led to the solving of the Sharon Tate and the LaBianca murders.
The development of information from the 2 separate investigations of the Tate and LaBianca cases led detectives to the conclusion that the crimes in both cases were committed by the same group of people.
Now the burden was on the police and prosecutors to unravel an unbelievable tale of murder and manipulation. Manson had a troubled childhood.
When I was a child, I used to be crying and bitching, and the old man said, "You do the crime, boy?" And I'd say, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, shut up and do your time."
Charles Manson was a small-time crook and loser with a big ego and a lot of charisma, and convinced a number of ragtag kids to join with him in his vision and to kill for him.
Most of his life had been spent in jails, reformatories, and prisons.
A person that's raised on the street at 16 years old is generally about 55 in their minds.
This was a person that had grown up to learn the tricks of the trade of the criminal, and he used this to his advantage.
My game is me. I'm king of God, and don't mess with me.
When he was released in March 1967, Charles Manson had spent more than half his 32 years in institutions.
It was a perfect storm. Manson walks out of jail at this moment when all these forces are taking place in youth culture that allow for someone like him to succeed in carrying out his devious plan.
All I want is the little girls. I love them little girls.
He himself would say, do not call us hippies.
They hated hippies. They referred to themselves as slippies because they said they would slip under the awareness of society.
In those days, in 1969, the average hippie was a flower child, all wanting peace and love, and Manson was promoting racial hatred and stealing and killing.
Investigators came to understand that the words written in blood at the murder scenes were messages rooted in Manson's mind to Beatles songs such as Helter Skelter. They were connected to Manson's prophecy of Armageddon.
They'd sit around on LSD listening to the White Album, and they'd hear the message that the Beatles were sending to the black people.
He said, the Beatles are telling it like it is. Helter Skelter's coming down.
That was the name that the family gave to the revolution.
Well, Manson's definition of Helter Skelter had to do with this really idiotic white supremacist sense of a impending race war. And according to Manson, there would be this race war that in his mind would be won by African Americans.
In my opinion, Charles Manson had one extraordinary talent. And that talent was to spot other sociopaths as they were walking down the street, identify them, and charm them. Never in history has there been a band of sociopaths that would act as one in such a heinous way.
The Manson trial for the Tate and LaBianca murders started in June 1970. Charlie was tried alongside 4 female members of his family.
At the trial, there were press from all over the world. They would just be there day after day reporting on every little thing that happened in the courtroom.
Prosecutors feared that the defense would plead insanity.
The fact that someone has a twisted, bizarre, irrational mind does not necessarily mean he is insane in a legal sense.
Charles Manson had enough control over his thoughts and behaviors that he would not have been thought to be insane.
Manson's lawyers backed down on the insanity defense. Prosecutors had to tie the defendants to the evidence found at the crime scene. They did this by linking them to the words written in blood.
And when those words were found printed in blood at the murder scene, I said that was the equivalent of Manson's fingerprints being found at the murder scene.
But the toughest challenge for the prosecution was to prove that Manson was the grand mastermind behind it all.
They would do anything that he wanted. In fact, that was a key piece of evidence that I used against him. But I pointed out to the jury, look, these people wouldn't do anything without his direction and guidance.
Patricia Krenwinkel's father was convinced.
Do you think you're still under the influence of Charles Manson?
I definitely do.
A former Manson follower, Paul Watkins, testified that Manson was hoping to start a race war.
All of a sudden, there got to be talk of revolution and killing and stabbing people and pigs and oh man, and it just kept building and building, and he built it more and more.
Manson family member Linda Kasabian was a star witness for the prosecution. She was the lookout at the Tate and LaBianca murders.
and she heard these horrible, horrendous screams coming from men and women, constant screams, pleading for their lives, coming from inside the residence. At that point, she ran up to the residence. She wanted the carnage to stop.
The thing that I can liken that first trial to is it was a carnival. You had these 4 crazy defendants that you never know what they were going to do.
Things were just as unpredictable outside the LA courtroom. Manson family members held vigils and played